speakers and our moderator, Professor Mark Lemley, our speaker, Professor Adam Mossoff from George Mason University, and Attorney Cindy Cohn from the Electronic Frontiers Foundation. I appreciate them coming out here to have this discussion about a really important topic, net neutrality. I'm going to give you a small bit of information on the background, and then we're going to go straight into the discussion. Professor Mossoff joined George Mason's law faculty in 2008. His focus is on the doctrinal intersection between the theoretical and the doctrinal issues of property and intellectual property. He focuses on intellectual history and patents. He's taught in areas of patent law, property, cyber law, jurisprudence, estate trust, and property theory. He graduated of the University of Chicago Law School, where he was a research assistant to Richard Epstein and held the Bradley Fellowship. Ms. Cohen is the legal director at the Electronic Frontiers Foundation, which is in San Francisco, and as well as their lead general counsel. She is responsible for overseeing EFF's overall legal strategy and supervising their 10 staff attorneys and their legal fellows. Ms. Cohen first became involved in EFF in 1995 when they asked her to be lead attorney in Bernstein v. Department of Justice, a very successful First Amendment challenge to U.S. export restrictions on photography. And now they're going to discuss with you a very important issue of net neutrality. Thank you.
All right, thanks for coming. Kevin told me that my job was to start by spending 5 minutes explaining exactly what net neutrality is before we got into the panel discussion. And I think if I can do that in maybe 3 minutes, then I'll also explain the meaning of life in the remaining 2 minutes, because there are roughly comparable levels of complexity and disagreement associated with both questions. So let me give you a little bit of background of sort of where we are and why we got here. The internet is built on a set of very simple protocols for the transmission of information between computers. And those protocols were designed according to an architectural principle that computer scientists refer to as the end-to-end principle. And the basic idea of the end-to-end principle is the transmitting parts of your network are stupid. They don't have any intelligence built into them. Their job is obtain a packet, make some very minimal determinations that allow you to push that packet off to the next person and send it off. And in particular, the end-to-end architecture means that from the perspective of an internet transmission, from the perspective of the companies who actually own the wires or the bandwidth, all we do is pass packets of data back and forth across our network. What's in those packets of data, what they can do, and how they recombine are things left to the intelligence designed at the edges of the network. Right? People write software of various things, various levels of complexity to do a wide variety of things. And as long as that software can translate information into packets that will travel throughout the network will happily pass it back and forth. The result of that was that the transmitters of the information are essentially agnostic as to what kind of information is being transmitted across the internet. It might be a packet containing an email, a portion of an email. It might be a packet that's part of a video that somebody is downloading. It might be an ongoing telephone conversation. It might be a computer virus. From the perspective of the internet, all we know is it's a packet and it's getting routed to the proper end. That architectural principle has come under substantial strain for a couple of reasons. One, technical, that is, there's both the ability and, in many cases, the desire to have your computer network differentiate among packets. So we might want to do that, for example, to have the computer network weed out at the network space a packet that we know is associated with a computer virus, rather than delivering it to the end user and hoping that the end user has antivirus software. Or we might want to preference some packets. We might want to say, well, this is a packet for an ongoing phone call. The phone call's not going to work unless the packets actually arrive pretty quickly. This one over here is a piece of junk email, and it's not so important to us that it arrive right away. If it arrives 5 minutes later, it's not the end of the world. So on the technical side, there are reasons why one might want to prefer some packets over others and make the internet non-neutral in how it passes information. There are also some business reasons people might want to do that. Some of the internet providers engage in what they call demand management. So if you're Comcast and you're concerned that too many packets are traveling across your network to a particular person and slowing down the access to the internet for others, you might engage in what Comcast refers to as demand shaping, which is to say identifying those people who are engaged in heavy use of peer-to-peer file sharing networks and slowing their packets down. Or it might be the case that you have a particular interest in the source of packets, especially if the source of that packet is competitive, right? So Comcast, which provides for pay television to people over its cable network, might not like the idea that you are downloading illegally television shows through a peer-to-peer network, and so competing with it. Verizon, which provides telephone services, might want to preference phone call packets for which it is receiving money, but not preference and indeed delay phone call packets from Skype for which it is not receiving money. And finally, once we know what's in a packet, or once we know who it comes from and what it's about, we might also be able to price discriminate amongst those packets. So maybe it's the case that Google, which makes lots of money on the internet, would pay extra money to send its packets faster or to avoid having its packets unduly delayed than would some small individual. So in all of these cases, there are incentives and maybe efforts to alter the basic neutrality of the internet and to preference some packets to discourage other packets or to charge differential amounts of money to transmit different types of information across the internet. Enter the government, which has for the last 10 years or so been talking about imposing a regulatory framework that would preserve some level of network neutrality. Right, would prohibit some kinds of packet discrimination, though what kinds of packet discrimination, I think, depends on who's doing the suggesting and when you're asking either the Congress or the FCC what they're talking about. To date, there is no regulation that requires network neutrality, though there is a draft, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking from the Federal Communications Commission, which would impose some limitations on discrimination amongst packets. But the debate over whether or not the internet ought to be neutral, and if the internet ought to be neutral, whether or not government ought to be in the business of causing it to stay neutral, is one that's been going on for 10 years and is in full swing in Washington right now. Well, so let me start with our panelists by asking this question. You know, we don't, as a general matter, worry about or think we need government intervention in a competitive marketplace, right? Because we think competitive marketplaces usually will sort out what the customers want. So if customers want network neutrality and it's a competitive market for internet access, well, somebody will pop up to provide neutral internet access because they'll be able to charge more money for it. Are we in a competitive broadband market now? Is this a market that government shouldn't be involved in because the market will take care of it?
I don't think so. I mean, the numbers are pretty clear. I think it's something like 80% of Americans have two choices at best for broadband service. I mean, so there's separate things that are all, you know, the internet is a protocol that allows a lot of things. And so I guess there's the debate is kind of bifurcated between broadband and wireless in a way that I think is unfortunate, but if you're thinking about the markets, it might be useful at least to think about them a little differently, although I think you get to the same answer for both of them. It's just a little different. But between Verizon and AT&T, you have a huge, on the wireless side especially, you have a huge majority of Americans. Those are their only choices. And for many Americans, they don't have both choices. There are a few places where you have another provider. I live in San Francisco. There's Astound there. There's some cable things. But I think the numbers are pretty clear across the board that there's not a lot of competition in the broadband market or in the wireless market. Such that we're seeing that I think a lot of people feel comfortable that the market will magically, without any thinking whatsoever, fix any potential network neutrality problem. I think that seems clear. The reason I'm hesitant is that I think there are very few examples of non-neutral behavior that we've seen so far, and most of them wouldn't actually be fixed by the rules that the FCC's promulgated, which raises a whole other set of concerns to me. But I think if you looked strictly at market competition, it's not really a very competitive market in broadband or wireless right now, and that is cause for concern if it's not cause for regulation.
When you say it is a competitive market, I think it's the classic answer is yes and no, because it depends on what you're talking about market. Because one of the underlying problems here, of course, is that you're dealing with utility companies that provide the access to the internet, and utility companies function under franchise monopolies granted by local and state authorities, and so the franchise monopolies that were created at the turn of the 20th century under the rubric of preventing destructive competition. And so they responded to this desire to prevent destructive competition by saying there's certain natural monopolies, and therefore we should create agencies and establish regulations to control and direct those agencies to ensure that they serve the public interest. Now, of course, we like competition. We want to promote competition, and now we're talking about having agencies promote regulations to promote competition. And my response to this is get the regulations and the controls out of the market as such, and that a lot of the problems that you see when Comcast or Verizon acts badly, and there are periodically, and there are bad actors, I don't deny that, but is that they're acting because of their legal monopoly power that they've acquired, because people can't compete with them. You can't just set up a competition cable network service and run it without first having to spend thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, getting the appropriate permits, getting the approvals from the local and state authorities, getting signed off by the FCC and the various federal agencies that control whether you can provide that services or not. And it's those barriers to entry that are preventing the competition from occurring. And moreover, when you say, is there a perfect, is the market competitive? I'm somewhat surprised to hear people say that it's not, insofar as we have explosive innovation in the internet today in ways that we couldn't even have imagined 10 years ago or 15 years ago. If talking just in terms of applications, so you talk about the end-to-end issues, right? Just in terms of the applications on the end, right? You have blogs. No one foresaw the rise of blogs 15 years ago. YouTube, Facebook, Skype with its VoIP, and then all of these the massive user interface worlds, Second Life, World of Warcraft, Picasa, Living Social. You have the whole rise of cloud computing. Again, wireless. No one foresaw the rise of wireless. If you look at all of the literature on the internet and antitrust at the turn of the 21st century, it's all talking about the bottleneck at the last mile, and the concern about how people can only get onto the internet through this bottleneck at the last mile being the copper line that runs from the telephone line to your house, and that the local baby boom monopolies had control over that. And all of that discussion has completely gone away because wireless completely uprooted that whole concern and made it moot. And wireless was something that no one saw coming about. In fact, if I had said to you even 10 years ago that you would have a phone that you would not only be able to surf the web and check email and play games, but that it would be a GPS, and that you could interrelate. Someone could send you an email, and you could push and hold on the address, and it would instantly go to Google Maps. And then in Google Maps, you hit directions, give me directions, and it would convert into Google GPS. And that this would all be on your phone. You would have looked at me like I was crazy. Like, what? I mean, no one foresaw the radical, Schumpeter says the creative destruction that comes from the development of these types of technology. And so we are seeing innovation occur both on the ends and in the provision of the underlying infrastructure of the internet as well.
Well, so let me then push on that, right? So it's absolutely right to say we've seen enormous innovation on the internet, and I think everybody agrees with that, and that's a great thing, and we want to hold on to it, right? But the advocates of network neutrality regulation would say, I think, yeah, we've seen all that innovation because we've had a neutral internet. And so the question is, are we going to keep a neutral internet in the absence of regulation? Cindy?
I'm not sure. I think that it's been pretty hard to predict, and I'm not a rush to regulating. I mean, EFF believes in a neutral internet. We're not sure that we've yet seen any proposal for regulating the internet that will actually create neutrality, and we've been highly critical of the proposals so far. And I continue to be somewhat skeptical. Especially if you're going to. I mean, this gets into some process issues, but if you're going to try to locate the kingmakers for deciding whether things are neutral in the Federal Communications Commission, I think you're starting off in a really bad place if you want something that's going to protect consumers. EFF, we don't really. I don't care about Google, and I don't care about Verizon. I don't care about AT&T. I care about all the customers. And that's kind of the perspective we come from. The FCC as an agency has been surprisingly tone deaf to what actual people need with regard to their technology, and instead pretty beholden to the very people that they're being asked to regulate here. So I'm not sure that we need. I see that there's a potential problem here. I think it's been laid out pretty well. I haven't seen a lot of instances of the problem such that I feel like we're in a really good position to be proposing big swaths of regulatory authority to the FCC. There's some interesting history to how this came about. And the FCC used to regulate most of the pieces of so the internet's in layers, right? I mean, the application layer, and then we go all the way down to I think there's 7, right, layers of the internet.
Depends on how you count.
Yeah, as usual, it depends on how you count. But in any event, I think that innovation on the application layer is somewhat interesting, but a little bit beside the point in terms of thinking about, because that's not where people are concerned. People are concerned at a deeper level. The FCC used to have authority under Title II of the FCC Act. They used to view AT&T in how they handled the packets of the internet as regulating them the same way that they're regulated in the way that they handle the phone system. My timing's going to be off in this, but the FCC changed that and decided to regulate internet services differently. I think it was the late 80s or actually the late 90s. But in any event, there was a Supreme Court decision that called Brand X that upheld the FCC's right to shift its ability to regulate the internet to one where it's not regulating the infrastructure of the companies, but really doesn't have a lot of regulatory authority at all over the internet. At least it didn't. And Brand X, in the Brand X case, the Supreme Court said that's okay. The FCC can change its mind about this or make this decision. If we took the FCC back to just regulating kind of core infrastructure stuff, I think we'd have a less worrisome basis to think about how to create network neutrality than the one that the FCC has chosen. And the FCC has chosen to say that because the internet is hooked onto the phone system, they have ancillary authority to do whatever they want on the internet, that's the part that makes me the most nervous. So that's a long way to answer a simple question. I think the simple question is, it's not at all clear to me that we need regulation to enforce network neutrality, but I think it's worth watching very closely.
On this issue, actually, I'm happy to be in agreement with Cindy in that very often the complaint is that the net neutrality is a solution in search of a problem. Is sometimes the accusation against it, and that it's based upon a lot of hypotheticals. They could do this, or they might do this, or it's based upon some anecdotes, real anecdotes, but they're anecdotes of single instances of bad behavior, like Comcast, that slowed down BitTorrent packets. That's what led to this initial decision by the FCC back in 2009. I think that then started the process for moving towards actually adopting explicit regulations. It's interesting that the problem with Comcast initially, they could have brought a lawsuit as for contract violation, because in your contract agreement with Comcast at that time, there wasn't a provision. You were paying for access to the internet, and they would have had a viable contract claim. In fact, they should have just bought a class action for all Comcast subscribers who had violation of their contract terms that Comcast provided. You pay me a certain amount of money and I'm going to provide you internet service. There were no provision in those contracts that said, by the way, we might surreptitiously slow down your access if we deem that you are engaging in imposing unreasonable load on the internet.
I'm guessing the contract doesn't say that anymore.
Probably not, but it's been mooted out by the regulations. It doesn't need to.
I suspect there's no class action provision in their contract anymore.
So, but also, it's also sometimes important to realize that the internet that we have today is not the internet that was created back in the 60s when it started as DARPANet and then even started to develop through the 80s through the universities. I mean, it really is an internet that has been created through private investment by companies, and very oftentimes we don't realize the amount of money that has been put into this, that has been put into the internet. So just to give you a couple numbers, and this is from the DOJ's filing in 2006 with the FCC when they originally started to consider whether they should adopt net neutrality regs. That Verizon was for its Fios network. I'm a consumer of Fios. They have spent up to $140 billion in creating this network, the fiber optic cable network. AT&T invested $500 million in creating a fiber optic network in the state of Georgia alone, just in the state of Georgia. And Comcast has invested upwards of $11 billion between 2003 and 2006 in creating the resources to make it possible for people to have broadband access. These are substantial amount of numbers. I mean, I know today in our kind of post-TARP world, we're 800 billion here and 2 trillion there and all this stuff. People think, what's 11 billion? Trust me, 11 billion is a lot of money, right? And that's money that was invested before the companies really saw any return on their investment either. So they were creating the facilities. And these were sunk costs to them to try with the hope that the customers would come to them by the offer of internet service capability. So it's really, I think it's in their interest to continue to provide good internet service in accord with the property system that they've created on the internet, which is we want people to interact. Companies like standardization. To the extent that net neutrality has any meaning, and this is part of the problem, is that it's hard to define. It's one of the points the DOJ said in its brief that it filed with the FCC in 2006. It said, quote, "The mere fact that a definition of net neutrality remains elusive should give the Commission great pause before imposing regulation," end quote. I mean, so, who could, and it's great, and so net neutrality, it's a great term because it's great rhetoric. It was coined by Tim Wu, who's an advocate for net neutrality, and it shows you the power of rhetoric. Who can be against neutrality, right? Well, neutrality is good, and it's not good sometimes. Just like discrimination, who could be against discrimination? Well, discrimination is good, and it's not good in some instances. We're all in favor of discrimination when it comes to separate men and women's bathrooms, right? We like that. That's a discrimination. That's good discrimination. Economists love price discrimination. Laypersons look at economists and say, "Are you nuts?" Because they hear the word discrimination, and they think discrimination in its bad sense, in its rhetorical sense, in the sense of racial discrimination.
Because I won't want to have to pay more for my airline ticket than you do. It's not because of the word. I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, that's okay.
Well,
But I agree, Cindy. I agree that we should be careful here in imposing regulations, even proposing regulations when there really isn't yet even a conceivable problem yet that justifies controlling it. And it's unclear whether the existing rights under contract or property don't provide similar values.
So let me push both of you back on this a little bit, right? So so I often hear don't worry about it, right? The internet companies are going to continue to provide a neutral internet, notwithstanding, of course, the circumstances in which they don't, right? The Comcast slowing down BitTorrent, AT&T blocking Skype on its wireless service, blocking tethering access for phones, right? So there are examples. It's right to say that there's not been a massive departure where a company got up and announced, guess what, we're not neutral anymore.
And when they were called out on that, did they stop?
Well, the wireless folks haven't, no. And Comcast, as far as I know, is still at least claiming the right to engage in BitTorrent discrimination. I don't know whether they're still doing it. Part of the problem is they never told anyone they were doing it, right? They weren't transparent about it. It was
we found it.
Yeah, EFF actually figured it out.
Yeah, and they lied to us when we asked them.
They lied about it. They actually issued press release saying we're not doing this. But then again, what they were doing was slowing down what they claimed was the unreasonable load on their infrastructure.
Well, okay, but so this is
they weren't just slowing it down, though. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, this was rejecting a bits, right? This was pretending as if this thing wasn't happening. So you couldn't access information. It wasn't just a slowdown. So
people were transferring movies and songs
Well, so
billions of bytes of information over and causing a substantial, so small percentage of the users were engaging in illegal activities to.
Okay, but so
it'd be really nice if Comcast would actually come forward with some numbers so we could demonstrate whether this was true or not. Since they lied from the beginning, it's hard to believe them later.
Hang on, Cindy. So this is the issue I think that I want to push on a little bit, right? So I hear both of you say, oh, we're not sure there's a problem that justifies regulation. Maybe it's not happening all that often, maybe we don't need to worry about it because companies have an incentive to keep a neutral internet anyway. But then I also hear arguments that say something like, well, we're the wireline providers. Look at all the money we invested, right, as Adam points out in this stuff. And gosh, look at the people who are actually using BitTorrent. They're using all of this data bandwidth. They're hogging it up. They're probably doing something illegal with it, because many people on BitTorrent are. And those arguments seem to me to point in very different directions, right? It seems either we're arguing, no, we don't need regulation because people aren't going to divert away from the neutral internet, or we're arguing we don't need regulation because they are going to divert away from the neutral internet, and that's a good thing. Which is it?
Yeah. Should I start or should Cindy?
I think you should, because I don't think he's characterized my position correctly. So before I veer you off, let's let that, because I think he has actually characterized that.
Let's see when I join up against Mark.
Yeah. I thought this might happen.
I'll take it. My position is as I said before, neutrality can be good or it can be bad. It depends on what you're referring to and what you're talking about. And one of my concerns with net neutrality advocates is that they are engaging in what sometimes we call the Nirvana fallacy, which is they're talking about the benefits of having a neutral internet. And in the cost innovation and stifling of voice over internet protocol and Skype and things of that sort, they point to some of the examples, and then they say, see, so we need to maintain this. But what they don't talk about is that creating a regulatory structure which dictates to property owners how they can use their property brings tremendous costs, not just economic, but moral as well. And we are not operating in a vacuum here. We've had a long history of regulated industries where agencies have been created and have imposed regulations that have dictated to them terms of whether they can content discrimination or not, and things and things of that sort. And we know very well what happened in those industries, from the railroad industry to the telephone. I think it's great that you mentioned the telephone industry, because the telephone industry was just a disaster. In terms of the monopoly that was secured to AT&T by the federal government. In fact, there's a famous Saturday Night Live skit from the 1970s with Lily Tomlin doing a commercial where she's like, we're AT&T, and she hits a computer face panel, and she says, I just disconnected 10 people from their telephone calls, but we don't care because you have no choice. We're AT&T, and people laughed at that, but it was true. I mean, because you couldn't compete with them because they were a regulated monopoly. The wage and price controls that were imposed by Nixon in the 1970s that led to the stagflation. And even when the government has been concerned about competition, and so they say, all right, well, we're going to promote regulation to promote competition. Well, you had the breakup of AT&T in the early 1980s, which was another utter disaster, where a court created all these baby bell monopolies, and now we're dealing with a lot of the problem with this. The 1996 Telecommunications Act, which is largely recognized as just an utter disaster in the attempt to promote competition in the telecommunications industry, and the only people who benefited from it were the lawyers, which of course we don't mind in this room, but everyone else in society does. And also a case that I always love to talk about in my internet law classes is this case from 1984, Digidyne v. Data General Corp. In 1984, where the Ninth Circuit very declared with a lot of certainty and knowledge that Data General Corp. Had a monopoly in the operating system market with its RDOS product. Who here ever used or has even heard of RDOS? See, me too. I mean, because we're dating ourselves, right? Yeah, well. I mean, yes, and so you all have felt completely oppressed by this monopoly that Data General Corp. Had of RDOS for years and years and years, right? Exactly, right? I mean, and the government has proven the government is not the place you want us to be making predictions about either whether the competition is going to occur or it's not to occur. The best thing to do is to say that the property and contract rights will be implemented by the people who have them, and then to the extent that they violate other people's rights or violate terms of contracts, then they can step in and fix those mistakes.
Well, I don't think that there's no possible problem for network neutrality. I think there are possible problems with network neutrality. I believe in a neutral internet. I think it's important. I think that the definition of neutral can be comparison, and certainly, there are. A completely neutral internet doesn't exist today and won't forever, but it won't because there is packet discrimination that's going to happen in some situations. But I think it ought to be narrow, and it ought to be very carefully and technical rather than competitive. So EFF believes in a neutral internet. We're just uncomfortable with the proposals so far to try to ensure that the internet remains neutral, because they're being made without a lot of information about where non-neutrality is likely to pop up in the future. And they could, you be careful what you wish for. I mean, we called this a Trojan horse kind of problem. So I don't think that a non-neutral internet is never going to happen. But I don't think we're at the point yet where we have a good picture of what we ought to do when that happens. There's some things in the proposed rulemaking that I think are actually useful as a step forward. There's a bunch of transparency requirements in the rulemaking that I think are actually a very good idea. At least I'm not sure that the FCC is the right way to get there, but requiring transparency so Comcast can't lie to us next time, and so that people really are in a position to know what's going on, I think is a really useful thing, and something that's worthy of a lot of thought about how to get there. Now, that could be something that happens legislatively. I'm not sure you need an agency for this. But trying to put the pieces in place so that we can detect non-neutral behavior, which happens, because it's not all that easy. I mean, the BitTorrent spoofing is really what it was hard to figure out. And EFF has put together something called Test Your ISP, another thing called, actually Test Your ISP is Google's. There's something called Switzerland that we created that was a forcer to try to help give people some good feedback about what's going on with their packets. But honestly, they don't work very well. It's really hard to do something like that. And you really kind of have to be super geeky in order to even do it. And I don't think, as much as I love the geeks, they pay my salary, and I'm a good friend of them, more than geeks need to be able to figure out what's going on in the network for us to really be protected. So I think some transparency and pressure towards transparency is a good idea so that we can begin to see what's going on. And then decide about maybe some narrow things to do in response when things happen. But my concern is much more about a cure that's worse than a disease right now. Because, for instance, the FCC's proposed rulemaking wouldn't solve the Comcast BitTorrent problem. Why? Because the rulemaking allows discriminatory behavior when you're trying to stop illegal activities, and specifically calls out intellectual property and copyright problems as one of those things where they can behave neutrally. Well, all Comcast has to say, and I think they could say it with a straight face, is we were doing spoofing on our customers with BitTorrent because we thought they were engaging in illegal behaviors. Indeed, that dreaded copyright infringement is what we think they were doing, because after all, it's BitTorrent, and pay no attention to all the software that people download free and with permission under BitTorrent. Let's just pretend like BitTorrent only does one thing and it's bad. But anyway, in that scenario, I think Comcast could do exactly what it did all over again under the FCC's rules and be completely okay. And so if we're not solving the problem that spawned the regulation, then I think we've got a problem with the regulation.
Well, but so then the problem sounds like your regulation's not effective enough, right? We ought to be, should we be blocking Comcast from spoofing those packets, from blocking BitTorrent?
I think there are ways that you can make that happen that are much better than what we've done, and I think it would be a good thing to do. I think that the attention paid on this, the public attention paid on this, had a lot to do with them stopping. Certainly the FCC saber rattling and then ultimately suing did. Comcast has issued traffic shaping rules and been much more clear about what it is they're doing, to the point where my technicians who discovered the problem in the first place are fairly comfortable that if they're doing what they say they're doing, it's not a problem anymore. Bandwidth shaping is something that anybody who deals with a big network has to do a bit about it. This is why I say you can't really have a non-neutral internet. There's always some kind of shaping going on the internet. The question is it technically appropriate, and are there other things going on behind it? But absolute neutrality is a nice buzzword, but it's not actually how the internet works.
And the other instances that people have identified of where companies have done things surreptitiously, they've been corrected through norm pressure and through publication of what they're doing, like the blocking of the narrow emails.
Well, those are text messages, so the network neutrality wouldn't match it, wouldn't reach it anyway, because there's a phone system.
Some net neutrality advocates want net neutrality regulations to prevent something like that. But by calling them out and doing that, companies ended up with egg on their face vis-a-vis their customers, and I'd be shocked if they tried to do it again.
I agree with you. I think that to the extent that there's a public face, like there was with Comcast and I think with the NARAL text messages, although again, that's another one of my great examples of not solving the problem that you were setting out to solve in the regulations. There's a class of them. I think that it's fair, though, in the talks, in talking with people who are really deeper into this in terms of, people like at Google, like at Amazon, and the kinds of pressures that the big network providers are trying to put to basically make Google pay to have access to Comcast customers, right? That Google's search engine, nice search engine you got there. It'd be a shame if it loaded a little slower than Microsoft's Bing. Who's going to pay me, right, to do it? These are really hard for a consumer to get access to. In fact, that one would be easier. I keep framing things, but even deeper level kind of attempts to try to leverage the ability to discriminate on the network into another revenue source for the providers, I think can be hard to figure out and can be hard to draw attention to because it kind of ends up really deep in the pipes. So that's why I like transparency. I think it's a good start, and I think that then we could see, are we getting at this problem or not?
So let me follow up on that, right? So suppose we've got a transparency regime in place, which is a kind of regulation, I take it, yep. Or maybe it's driven by some entrepreneurial people who find the instances of lying and expose them.
Like EFF?
Like EFF.
We do that, and I'd love to triple my budget so I can hire the 50 full-time people to do that. I mean, it's a big job.
But I take it that may be the consumer-directed bandwidth shaping may be affected by transparency. Yeah. But if it's business to business, and you just identified Google, that doesn't sound like something that transparency is going to drive, right? So the CEO of Verizon said publicly, Google, they're just a free rider. They're free riding on this internet infrastructure we've built, and they should have to pay more to send their packets over the internet than other people. Right? So if Verizon says, yeah, you know what, we're going to have an exclusive search engine. Right? You're a Verizon customer. You're going to use whichever search engine we choose for you, and it'll be whichever one pays us the most money. Mm-hmm. Transparency is not going to solve that problem, I take it.
I agree, and that's why I say, transparency can get us so far, and then we can think about the problems that are left, as opposed to trying to sit here today.
So let's think about that. What would a non-neutral internet look like? Right? Are we going to have circumstances in which, right, if I want access to Google, I've got to sign up with this service provider? If I want access to these sporting events, I've got to sign up with this provider? We've got that already in some other contexts.
I think that's a kind of over-the-top rhetorical scare tactic because you don't have to have, because it's in companies' interest to have standardization. In the 19th century, you didn't have to have a government agency saying to the railroad companies, your railways have to be the same gauge. Otherwise, different train engines won't run on your railways. They didn't need the government agency to tell them that. You didn't need a government agency to say that cars should drive on the right and you should drive on the right side of the road to go one way and the left side of the road to go the other. There's a natural incentive among providers of
complementary services. We actually do have government rules that say you got to drive on the right side of the road.
We have that now. Just like there's an agency that dictates to the railroad companies that the railway gauges have to be a certain way, but they rose through private coordination in the first place by the property owners, because when you have complementary network services, it's in their interest to network, especially in today's network. I mean, today you would have a hard time being a company if you offered to provide a service to a customer and said, but by the way, you get no access to anybody else's customers. And, in fact, this is in a sense the assumption that's built within the net neutrality debate is that proprietary systems are somehow bad because it's their interest to be closed off to the world, right? So therefore, no one in here owns an iPhone. No one in here owns a Kindle. No one in here uses the integrated proprietary services that Google provides to the Droid. All right. Let me ask you, who here has an iPhone?
I don't know if they're proprietary. I think they're open source in Droid.
No, the OS and the Droid is open source, but the Google use of its software is proprietary. It's search engine algorithm and its other software code. Who here has a Kindle? I mean, and who here is going to maybe get a Kindle Fire or has an iPad? These are proprietary closed systems. In fact, Apple is a 100% closed system, and yet it wants to be open because it makes its product more valuable if it's open to other people who have
Well,
access and network.
if Apple wanted to be open, Apple could be open, right? Apple wants to benefit from the openness of the internet while having its own set of closed extensions attached to it.
What I mean open is that it's accessible to other people. For the same reason that private companies let you enter their buildings from the openly accessible sidewalks.
No, but that's not, I mean, boy, I was with you, and then you just veered off into where I had to disagree.
Well, that's good. That's why we're
For
here.
a bunch of it, but Apple, I mean,
Hit me
trying
hard,
to get an app into the App Store is a big problem for a lot of people, and there's a whole bunch of apps that have not been able to get in the App Store because they might compete with products that Apple wants to put out, and certainly for a while
or that Apple's customers AT&T.
What's the problem with that?
Well,
Companies, companies make decisions about what they're going to offer to sell. Just because
well, then don't pretend like it's open.
But just because I'm a farmer doesn't mean that I have the right to force a supermarket to sell my product.
All I'm pushing back on is your argument that Apple's open. It's not.
No, I meant
It's
open.
not, and it has impacts.
Right, no, it's
not.
proprietary. It's a closed system. I said that it's open in terms of it's open in terms of the network capabilities. That's what I'm talking about.
Unless you are competing with them or something that they have an interest in, right? Like running Skype over the AT&T network or running tethering. Yeah, well, so look, I mean, I think we're back to, in some sense, a kind of central disconnect to me, right? Which is sometimes the argument I hear against network neutrality regulation is, don't worry, everything's going to be neutral and fine. And sometimes the argument I hear is, yeah, it's my property and I can do what I want. And sometimes what I'm going to want to do is close it. Now, maybe we think that shouldn't be a problem. That seems a perfectly reasonable position to take, but it's a very different objection to network neutrality regulation than one that says we don't need regulation in order to keep the neutrality of the internet.
Right, and to the extent that someone wants to close themselves off in exercising their property rights, which I think they should have a right to do, it's only a problem insofar as there's barriers of entry from competition created by the utility and other regulations. Okay. And so, and the solution by the net neutrality advocates is great. There's all these problems caused by regulations, so let's have more regulations. And that's just more than, and if the problem is the regulations, let's question the base root of the regulations and not try to create more regulations to cure those regulations, which will lead to more regulations to have to cure the problems in those regulations. So either transparency regulations, and then that will lead to more regulations because then we can get at the real problem.
Yeah, but I just have to push back on you. I really don't think that the problem of non-neutrality is created by regulations. I mean, regulations cause a lot of problem, believe me. I'm with you on most of it, but I don't think that causes this problem. I think that, in fact, I think that this problem is caused, as I think Mark laid out pretty well, that there's a lot of constraints on the end-to-end principle now. And you'll notice that none of the things that he mentioned as constraints on the end-to-end principles had anything to really do with regulation creating constraints on the end-to-end principle. I don't think regulation is the problem. So I don't think just... I guess I want to push back on you. I think that to the extent that there's a problem with network neutrality, I don't think it's the government created it. I think that the way that the network has evolved is starting to create it, and so we have to address it that way. I still don't think that the regulations as proposed right now fix it or cause bigger problems. I mean, this is where EFF always is there's this funny debate. It's like net neutrality, no net neutrality, and we're like, well, actual neutrality is a really good thing, and all the ways you people are proposing to get us there scare the bejesus out of me.
Right. So two other notes here to think about before I want to open this up to questions shortly. So one is, at the same time that certain aspects of the government are pushing for regulation that would require neutrality and openness, other aspects of the government are pushing for regulation that would specifically require packet discrimination. Most notably in the intellectual property space, where the Protect IP Act was introduced in the House today to say, you must in fact not send packets on a neutral basis. You must prevent packets from going to certain sources. So we can imagine regulation being used as a wedge to drive a non-neutral internet, right? Even in circumstances where it's nominally about neutrality. But I also want to think about how the market dynamics play into this, right? So Adam talked about the legacy of regulatory monopolies in the utility space, and certainly 5, 6 years ago, it seems like if there's going to be a kind of economic bargaining open market towards a non-neutral internet, it's one in which the wireline owners have the internet folks over a barrel and they could charge some money, right? So Verizon says, Google, pay us extra because your packets are more valuable. I'm not sure that's true in 2011. So let's suppose that Google, which certainly didn't benefit from a history as a regulated monopoly given an exclusive franchise, were to say to Comcast or Verizon, want your customers to keep having access to all the Google services they've come to know and love, right? Want them to have access to YouTube, to Gmail, to our Google search engine, fine, but it's going to cost you. Pay us some money.
A reverse problem.
If we had a free market and we had to predict which way the money would flow, my prediction is the money's going to flow not from the Googles of the world to the wireline providers. It's going to flow from the wireline providers to the Googles.
And what I would, if I was Comcast and Verizon and AT&T in those contexts, I would all get together and say, let's not agree to pay Google. Unfortunately, antitrust laws prohibit them from doing that.
Fortunately, antitrust laws prevent them from doing that.
Because I think that's because that is what would be the natural response to that, which is that you are trying to take advantage of us now that you have a good product service, and we will respond by agreeing not to pay those increased prices. I mean, I don't think there's a problem with that. There's no violation of rights.
I think it's called a cartel. Right? And, even people who don't like much antitrust law think cartels are generally a bad idea, right?
Well, insofar as they're not violating anybody's property or contract rights, I don't see what the problem is.
I am artificially depressing the price I would otherwise have paid.
No, they're not artificially depressing the price. They're refusing to pay Google's demand to hold.
Sounds like artificially depressing the price you would have paid in a free market.
No, you're changing the terms of your hypo. Your terms of your hypo is Google wants to now charge them above market price because they've got them over a barrel. Now you're changing it to below market price.
What do you mean above market price? The market is what it is. We either have a rule that says you pass packets through and nobody gets to charge one or the other on the basis of the packets, or we don't. And if we don't have that rule, then what would happen in a market negotiation is the people with the power, the people who have you over a barrel, are the ones who are going to get the money.
Well, as you know from my study of historical cartels like the sewing machine combination, that I don't think they're necessarily problematic, and that they actually bring lots of inefficiencies and innovation. I just published an article about this. The sewing machine combination brought substantial economic innovation in the 19th century, and in fact, it was the very first successful trust and cartel and patent pool in U.S. history. So it brought sewing machines to the market. It brought a lot of innovation in terms of lowering prices and whatnot, and made everybody better off.
All right.
Well, so the people that I care about are not in this hypo, right? I don't care about, Google can take care of itself, and so can Verizon. I care about the next Craig who's going to build the next Craigslist, or the next guy in his garage who's going to want to build the next app. And the question I ask about all of these systems is, how do we build the system that makes that allows because that's where all this exponential growth that everybody sings praises about comes from, in my opinion. It comes from having really low barriers to entry to participate in whether you're building a business or a cultural event or a simple free speech platform. Turns out I care about that too. With no money whatsoever. What kind of barriers to entry are we going to create to participating in the internet? Not just the internet marketplace, not just the internet consumers, but the internet. And so that's the filter that I look through all of this from. That's why cartels kind of scare me, because what happens? The cartel, the dinosaurs get together and try to stop evolution, right? And that's true whether it's Google and Facebook turning around to try to stop the next competitor, or Verizon and AT&T trying to stop the next competitor. So that's why I don't know much about sewing machines, although we did run a fabric shop when I was a little kid. But cartel behavior worries me, because I worry about the pull into innovation, and not just innovation, but the internet is about free speech too. It's not just a business center.
All right, let's open it up for questions. Daniel.
Just going from that last comment on free speech, do either of you see significant infringement on the rights of the companies who host Comcast, right? If they say, we just disagreed with Google's speech, that's why we're
Well, that was narrow. That was the narrow situation where they were blocking the narrow emails because they disagreed with the content of that speech, and they were called out. They were called out for that, and they were stopped for that reason. And so, I mean, again, so they point to that as an example of here's a problem, but the problem got fixed.
Right. Though I think Daniel's actually pointing it in the other direction, right? So the wireline companies often argue you can't regulate us, you can't impose a non-discrimination rule on us because you're compelling us to speak by allowing the packets to pass through our wire. I have to confess I find that argument singularly unpersuasive, right? It's well, if we took it seriously, we couldn't have a regular telephone network, which has been operating under a non-discrimination principle for 100 years. But if you were to balance the interests of speakers, I got to say that people who are actually communicating information or are actually listening to information probably get a lot more in that balance than the people who own wires through whom packets without any information content associated with them are being passed in a neutral manner. Yeah, in the back.
What are the privacy implications? Because I don't know much about tech behind it, but essentially it seems the same technology that authoritarian regimes use to censor, because you need to determine what's in that packet.
Yeah.
What are the privacy implications and what kind of precedent do we set for
I mean, there's a thing called deep packet inspection, which is being deployed already by a lot of companies, including big ISPs. Verizon does it, AT&T does it. I'm not sure that certainly the neutrality regulations that the FCC proposed have a huge law enforcement exception into them, and they also have a pretty big provider exception in them. So what deep packet inspection and people's privacy is just simply not going to be protected by network neutrality regulations, nor is it going to be it's not going to be made any better or any worse by the network neutrality regulations. I just think it's orthogonal. To the extent that your privacy sucks online, your privacy is still going to suck online after network neutrality legislation, but not particularly in any way that's worse.
So Rob Frieden at Penn State has a fabulous article on deep packet inspection. One of the things he points out is that all of the companies who get DMCA exemptions from copyright infringement liability as conduit providers get it on the basis that there's no way for us to tell whether or not the material passing through our system is infringing copyright or not, right? So a rule or a case result that said, well, if you made a voluntary decision to engage in inspecting the nature of the packets that are passing through your system, you're welcome to do that, but you can't any longer claim that you're immune from copyright infringement for passing through the ones that are copyright infringement. Seems to me actually perfectly equitable and might require companies to think twice about whether they want to engage in deep packet inspection.
So I'm not really sure why we decided that neutrality is a good idea in the first place. I mean, I'm not a central planner, so I don't know whether neutrality is better for for everyone involved or whether some kind of huge discrimination is involved. But it seems it's better. But it seems like there's a very strong analogy between advocating for this neutrality with the obsession with wealth inequality. So what I mean by that is that with net neutrality, there's this big concern over the little guys versus the big guys and how much of bandwidth they're going to have access to of the internet. Are they going to be able to effectively compete against one another? And there's this big concern. And with the argument about wealth inequality, it seems like everybody's concerned about the little guy versus the big guy. It seems that if you instead focus on creating a system where everybody's access to internet increases, access to the internet to be able to speak, to be able to do whatever, increases a lot. In the same way, if you build a whole economic system where everybody can be better off, it seems like. Sorry, I'm not really phrasing this very clearly.
Great.
Yeah.
All I'm trying to say is that maybe the best thing is to whether it ends up being neutral or non-neutral, the various providers, whether it's the Googles or whether it's the Verizons and Comcasts, whether they end up being discriminatory or neutral, let them do what they need to do to make the most profit that they can so that they can then reinvest that in more technology and more bandwidth in the future. And then, the Craigs of Craigslist, can, have access to, gigabit per second internet instead of, 14.4 kbps.
You want to say something?
Sorry that was a little scattered.
Yeah, I have to say I don't think it works. I appreciate the effort to try to bring current events into this, but the big fight between the big players in the network neutrality debate aren't little guys versus big guys, right? I mean, Google doesn't qualify as a little guy, and neither does AT&T and Verizon. I mean, little guys have very little to say about what's actually going on in DC. They're kind of floated up as little puppets around it, but it's not a. I just don't think it maps very well to a soak the rich kind of thinking. I think
He was picking up on your earlier comment about how you were
well, I'm concerned about little guys, but nobody gives a. Nobody cares what I think.
Well censored.
We don't. I mean, I just. Well, that's very nice, but I mean, the people who are actually proposing the regulations and the people who are opposing the regulations are all big players. There's no little guy movement. There are little guys involved in the fight. I don't mean to say this. I mean, my friends at Public Knowledge and Free Press are by all definitions little guys, and they're trying to do this. But I think, I guess, to step back from your question, I think that it isn't. You don't have to be a central planner in order to look and try to find the roots of how the internet has grown, and what factors about the internet's architecture have contributed to the phenomenal growth. And I think that Professor Lemley laid them out pretty well early on. And a lot of it is low barriers to entry. And so if you care about the growth, and if you actually, this doesn't take deep analysis or central planning. Low barriers to entry is one of the reasons why the internet has been a really tremendous success. And so you have to think hard about increasing the barriers to entry. If you care about innovation. Now, maybe you don't care about innovation. Maybe the internet we have today is exactly what you want and you don't want anything new. But if you do want new things, I think thinking about how we got to what causes innovation to happen in the internet space, both again, I think about market innovation as well as speech innovation. I'm deeply, I care about the internet. I don't care about commerce on the internet. I care about speech as an engine of free speech.
Let me jump in here.
Can I just respond
Yeah.
as well? I mean, something I think you're getting at is that, and this goes to what I said about they're not Nirvana fallacy in the sense that they're trying to say that, well, we want unending innovation that will be made available through regulations, and what they don't recognize is that regulations bring costs too, and one of those costs is what's called agency capture, and which is incredibly non-transparent. And in fact, one of the reasons why the net neutrality debate is occurring between Google and Comcast and all that stuff is they're all trying to deploy their various political muscle to basically stick it to the other person through the government rather than in the market. And the people who end up getting stomped on here are the people who don't have all of the capital to invest in the lobbyists and to lobby the Congress or lobby an agency to try to get to do what it wants to do. We witnessed this just this past year. To stomp on Professor Lemley is the American Inventors Act, right? Which was the product of 10 or 15 multinational, multi-billion-dollar corporations deciding to make the patent system a lot harder for the next small guy to come along to come up with the invention that's going to take them down. Because Steve Jobs and Bill Gates, they all remembered that they were like small guys in garages once, and there were these huge companies, Data General Corp and DEC, and all of these gigantic companies that they're no longer in existence because of them, and they want to stop the next Steve Jobs and Bill Gates from coming around.
Okay, Adam. So I thought cartels are good was the crazy thing you were going to say for the day. But now you're just way out there. So let me say a couple of things here, right? The irony, and it is what makes this a hard problem, I think, is something that Adam is pointing at, right? Which is the history of the internet is one in which the openness, the freedom of somebody to innovate that comes out of this architecture is what drives innovation in applications. And if you look at both the history and I think the projected future, we could have pretty good innovation in the wireline. We could make the wires better by spending a lot more money at them, right? We get FIOS by investing a lot of money. But the amount of the social value we're likely to get out of that innovation in the wires is dwarfed by the social value we're likely to get from the innovation in everything that goes into those wires, all the software, all the speech, all of the websites, all of the new technologies. So we want a world, just sort of as a question of what's best for innovation, best for society. We want a world that actually is driving all that innovation. Historically, that world has been the neutral internet. Right? And it's been the neutral internet precisely because it meant there wasn't somebody controlling the strings who had a Mother May I regime that said, you know what, you want to innovate on my platform, you got to get my permission. AT&T used to say that. AT&T used to control what devices could be connected to the network back when it was a monopoly.
A legal monopoly.
Exactly. So the irony, the difficulty here, right, is that the advocates of net neutrality regulation are advocating for government regulation designed to prevent government regulation, in a sense, right? They're arguing for government regulation designed to keep open something which it looks like we might otherwise shut down in various different ways, both private and public. That is, as Adam points out, a very fraught thing. It has, of course, nothing to do with the American Inventors Act, which might or might not do various significant things to the patent system. I don't frankly think it does very much, but it certainly doesn't do them as part of a vast left-wing conspiracy to shut down the little guy. Kevin?
Right.
Consumers not being able to use the internet the way they wish to. And then the other issue brought up by Professor Mossoff of internet companies maybe not being able to innovate the way they would wish to. And then Professor Lemley, you're talking about the possibility that maybe software innovation is more important than network and wire innovation, or maybe customers getting what it is they want. But I'm hoping the speakers can address this one point, and it'll probably be the last question. But we're leaving out the question of who should get to choose. We're talking about, different forms of innovation and what we want someone to come along and do, and someone to come along and invest in. But we're ignoring the question of who should get to choose what gets innovated and how, and why should they get to choose? Why should it be the government versus the network owners versus the software owners versus the consumers? Who should get to make the choice?
Well, you're right. I mean, and at root, that's what at root the debate is over kind of a default policy presumption of which do you more favor, kind of bottom up, private ordering mechanisms in which people are left free to make the decisions that they want to through property and contract regimes, or more top down, either through surgical regulatory strikes or kind of massive regulation, top down public ordering regimes. And I think both history and theoretical, on historical grounds and theoretical grounds, I think that if you want innovation, bottom-up private ordering is the place to go.
Cindy?
I think it's a hard question. I mean, I think that as Professor Lemley said, I think that it needs to happen bottom up. I think, but I'm not sure private ordering is all by itself going to get us there, and I'm a little worried about that. So I think we should let private ordering try. And then we should regulate to try to create more, in a more narrow and focused way to try to create more space for innovation and knock down the barriers for innovation. I think that's the role, to the extent we need a government role here, that's the role the government ought to take. What I see come out of the FCC right now is not that, and that's why I'm opposed to it.
And so here, this I think leaves us with the problem of why net neutrality is so hard, right? I strongly prefer private ordering over public ordering. I also strongly prefer innovation over stagnation. And I fear that this is an area in which private ordering is pushing us in a direction that's not going to drive innovation, right? It's moving away from a little guy gets to start something new towards a few big guys get together and sign a contract that controls the ability of other folks to come in. And so the difficulty is, right, how I trade those things off. And I'm not sure there's an answer to it, and there's certainly not an answer in the time we have remaining, which is basically none. So please join me in thanking the panel.
Thank you.